I judge a good poem in two ways. Firstly, I judge it by reading it from the page, but I also judge it by the way it sounds. So whether a poem has a certain rhythm or tone is as important as how it reads in your head. So both the page and the stage are the two criteria I'd use. Exactly the same, I'd say, and even more so in reading it aloud. So part of my job is for about 150 schools every year. I visit and I read poems to the children, and it's important that they can relate to the sound of the words as well as the meaning of the words. You think about how we communicate. We communicate in two ways. We write emails, texts, sometimes even letters, and we speak words. So that's how poetry should use both those mediums. We think of poems as being bound by a book. Poems should be spoken aloud. And when I write a poem, my first editing process is to read it aloud, to see how it sounds. Not as important as football at all. I wanted to be a football player and I wasn't very good. I was okay at football, but not good enough to be professional. And so I wrote a poem for something to do one day when I was 18. I didn't have a job and I sent it to a magazine and they published it and they sent me a check for $5. And I thought, great, I'll be a poet instead of a footballer. And I've never had another job since that day. And I'm 58, so that's 40 years I've been earning $5 a poem. You can imagine how wealthy I am. Because I think poetry is the most accessible, portable art form there is. So in every other art form, you need something else. You need a guitar to make music or drums. To be an actor, you need a stage and an audience and a play to be in. To be a poet, you only need words, and we all have words. So poetry to me is the sort of art form that everyone can embrace and everyone can become a poet if you have a voice. A lot of the time it's from things that have happened in my life when I was a teenager. For my teenage books, a lot of it is based on either my life when I was a teenager, things I've heard from teenagers I meet now, my own two sons who are now adults. And often I start a book with an idea of a location. So I have one main character and one location, and then I let things develop from there. For children, often it's based on what my two sons told me when they were young, what they did at school. They would come home from school, they would tell me about their day, partly because I was their father, but mainly because they knew I'd write a poem about it. And then one day my son Jack came home from school and said, "Something really good happened today. If you give me money, I will tell you what happened." And one day I will. Oh, for me, it's much easier to write poetry. Poetry comes naturally. I think poetry, the thing I love about poetry is I don't believe it has rules. So in prose, you have to write sentences. You have to have good grammar. You have to tell a story. A poem can be almost anything you want it to be. You make up the rules as you go. And sometimes breaking the rules is a good thing. And shows people, I mean, we break the rules all the time when we're talking. You see, I'm not talking to you in proper sentences, unfortunately. I would like to try, but I'm not that talented. So that's what I think poetry is, being able to break rules and hoping the audience approves. I'm not really the person to ask. I think you have to ask the young readers, to be honest. I know that, as I say, I go into lots of schools and I can read a poem which takes a minute or 2 minutes, and I can have an immediate impact. And the children can follow the poem easily because it's only a minute. If I write prose, if I read one of my prose books, it can take half an hour to tell a story. And that means they have to do a lot more following the story, and that can be more difficult. So a poem is just a little punchy thing. It's like a song, like that, and it's done. Well, more than that, but you know what I mean. Look, I wouldn't say it's popular, but it is. The problem is, I think, all over the world is that teachers feel nervous about teaching poetry, and they also feel they have to teach poetry rather than just enjoy poetry, and so that's a difficulty. I go into schools and I just try and get the children to laugh for 45 minutes. It's a very easy job I have, and I just talk and read poems and tell little stories and get them hopefully excited by poetry. So I'm doing my best, and my life has been devoted to making poetry appealing to young people. I hope after 40 years I've achieved something. I decided to write The Simple Gift because I wanted to write about some little events that happened when I was a teenager. So I left home very early and I lived in a disused train carriage for a short time in a town in Australia. And so that was the setting I wanted to have for the book. And so I started with the location. The location was the most important character at the start. And then I chose Billy, a 16-year-old boy, to become that main character in the train carriage in the small country town. And it all flowed from there. It was a very easy book to write. But as I say, I don't write like I think a lot of authors write, where they map out the whole story. I don't do that. I choose a location, a character, get that character into the location, and then see what happens. So it was easy. 3 months, done. I chose a book by Adrian Mitchell, who is a British poet. It's called Come On Everybody, and it's Adrian Mitchell is he's sadly died a few years ago. He's a wonderful British writer who writes both very, very serious political poems, or wrote very serious political poems, and wrote very, very silly poems for children. And he appealed to a huge audience, from 5-year-olds to old people. And that is a wonderful achievement. And his poems were so broad in scope, and they demanded to be read aloud. And he seems to me to be the perfect poet for the modern age. And I read one of his poems when I was young, and it went something like this. You'll pardon me if I don't get it exactly right. Most people ignore most poetry because most poetry ignores most people. When I read that, I knew I had a rule for poetry, and so I follow Adrian Mitchell's rule in poetry, I hope. I think it's an incredible thing you're doing, and I think that what's important is, and something that always baffles me, is that festivals invite lots of poets, adult poets who write for adults in their everyday festival, and yet poets often bemoan the fact that there's not enough readers of poetry. And the only way we are going to get readers of adult poetry is to get readers of children's and young adult poetry. And the only way we're going to do that is have festivals like this, and have writers who write for those people and who shout the poems out to those people. So it's like anything. If you get the people and excite them when they're young, hopefully they'll appreciate poetry for the rest of their life. So this festival is doing something not only for the city of Berlin and Germany, but it's doing something for the future of poetry. If we want poetry to have a future, we've got to appeal to 5-year-olds. They are the future.